Hello, everybody. I see on my clock it is 1 o'clock Brussels time, and I want to welcome you all to the European Marine Board's third Thursday Science webinar, which is happening today at this moment. These webinars are showcasing the science that's behind the European Marine Board publications. And today we are going to talk about the document on deep sea. So the title is, Are We Delving Any Deeper? An update on the Marine Board's position paper number 22. My name is Sheila Heymans. I am the Executive Director of the European Marine Board, and I will be your moderator today. So just for those of you that have not been at any of our webinars before, please make sure that your name is clearly entered. You can do that by clicking on the 3 dots on your picture. Especially when you're asking questions. And if you are going to ask questions, please do that in the Q&A, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. Make sure that you put in who your organization is, which country you're from, so that we can really, when I read the questions to our speaker, we can make sure that he knows who the question's from. So I will look at the questions and answers at the end and ask the questions to the speaker. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function. Only the host will be able to see it, so only the Marine Board Secretariat will be able to see it and will be able to help you. Please also be aware that the webinar is being recorded and live streamed, so it will be available afterwards on the Marine Board website and on our YouTube channel, and it will be live streamed there with a bit of a delay at the moment as well. So as I said, the focus of the science webinar today is the document position paper 22 on the critical challenges for the 21st century deep sea research. The document's called Delving Deeper. You can download the document from our website under publications, position papers. The link is at the bottom there. And our speaker today is Professor Alex Rogers. Alex was the chair of the working group on deep sea research. He is now the science director for REV Ocean in Norway, but he is still a visiting professor and senior research fellow at the University of Oxford. So thank you very much, Alex, for taking the time. And I'm going to stop sharing. And if you want to share your screen and take it away, that'd be great. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sheila. Let me just share my screen. And
we can see it, but it's not in full screen mode.
Hopefully it is now.
It is now. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, great. Let me just move this so I can actually see what I'm doing. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. I'm going to talk to you about the European Marine Board Position Paper 2022, Delving Deeper, Critical Challenges for 21st Century Deep Sea Research. Now, the report was published in 2015, and the kind of recommendations or key points that were raised by the report were actually listed here. So we concluded that we really had to increase fundamental knowledge about the deep ocean. We needed to get a much better understanding of drivers, pressures, and impacts in the deep sea. We really needed to look at cross-disciplinary research to address the challenges that we're facing in terms of managing human activities in the deep ocean. Funding was something that we touched on, and the need for more innovative funding mechanisms for deep sea research. Technology and infrastructure was obviously very important in terms of accessing such a remote ecosystem. And of course, human capacity in deep sea research and equity in capacity across the globe was then and still is a significant problem. And then other issues around data, governance and ocean literacy. And what I hope to do over the next 20-25 minutes is really to touch on these areas and see how things have changed over the last 5 years, or maybe not. So I think one thing that really has changed is the emphasis on blue economic development. And this probably has something to do with the COVID crisis that we've just gone through, and some of us are still going through. But also, I think that the recognition that current models of economics simply are not working, because they're essentially exceeding ecological limits of the planet, and also they're not very equitable in terms of society. And the blue economy really recognizes and respects the ecological limits which determine the safe operating space for economic activities and the minimum social standards that a fair economic model should address. And really the new definitions of the blue economy are very much following this mode of thinking, which has been described very eloquently recently by Katie Rayworth in her book, Donut Economics. And really the blue economy has triple bottom line objectives of environmental sustainability, being economically viable, but also socially equitable. And it should decouple socio-economic development from environmental degradation. And just to emphasize this triple bottom line, what we're talking about here is that economic activities in the ocean are sustainable economically. Preferably, they're actually positive for the environment and at very minimum neutral. And what I mean by positive for the environment, I mean in terms of climate, biodiversity, and ecosystems, and they're equitable for people as well. So the activities are inclusive, they're economically distributive, and they're just. And if we look at the kind of latest figures for maritime economies globally, they probably come from the OECD report in 2016, where they estimated that the ocean economy was worth about 1.5 trillion US dollars. About a third of that was associated with oil and gas, about a quarter with tourism, 13% with maritime transport and ports, 11% marine equipment, so shipbuilding and so on, and then 5% from various other activities. Something like 31 million people were employed at the time of this report in the maritime economy, and about a third of that employment came from fisheries and a quarter from tourism, with all other industries ranging between 1 to 8%. However, it must be said that this OECD report did not include small-scale fisheries, which actually account for about 100 million people in terms of employment and something like half the fish catch. And they also didn't address ecosystem services. And indeed, many countries are simply not accounting for their blue economies in a thorough way. Now, since 2016, things have changed significantly, and now states really are starting to look at their blue economies and what they actually comprise of. And I've pulled out one example here of the UK marine accounts for 2021, and some very interesting things leap out from this particular accounting exercise for a single coastal state. The first one was that UK marine natural capital assets were worth in the region of £211 billion, which I think was much more than people were expecting. But also that marine ecosystems were sequestering something like 10 to 60 million tons of CO2 per annum. So this really significant ecosystem service being provided in terms of blue carbon from ecosystems around the UK. And then the value of marine renewables was estimated to have increased by 37 times over the space of 10 years from 2008 to 2018. Now, bear in mind that the UK has probably one of the best researched marine real estates in the world, but it was notable that even for this report, data were incomplete for many aspects of natural capital accounting. More than a third of UK marine ecosystems, for example, were classified as unknown. So what we've seen here is a sudden increase in emphasis on the whole carbon aspect of the blue economy, both in terms of renewables, but also in terms of blue carbon. And hand in hand with that now is a serious push coming with COP26 to decarbonize economies globally. And one of the immediate impacts of that in the context of Europe is going to be the removal of offshore oil and gas infrastructure in the North Sea and indeed elsewhere globally. And despite what happened during the Brent Spar, how would I put it, not so much as crisis, but event, I guess, deep sea disposal is likely to be raised as a cheap option for this oil and gas infrastructure again, despite the fact that it is actually against the London Dumping Convention and indeed OSPAR policies. So again, we are probably going to be looking at research to really look at the relative impacts of various disposal options for this infrastructure again. At the same time, we're seeing this enormous increase in offshore wind. This is a slide from Aker, who are actually the company of the funder of REV Ocean, Schellinger Rocker, and Aker Offshore Wind are essentially looking at huge development of offshore, not just offshore wind, not just in shallow waters, but also in deeper waters as well. And you'll see from this slide, which is from an EIC report in 2019, that something like 80% of offshore wind resources are going to be located in water depths of more than 60 meters. And I should think that means a significant number of these installations will be probably in the deep sea. This is being driven from a number of things. First of all, there is more wind energy, basically the further away from the shoreline you go, but also people along the coast don't necessarily want to see wind farms when they're sitting on the beach on their holidays or living by the sea. So there is an element here of not in my backyard in terms of pushing this industry offshore. And of course, with decarbonisation of the economy comes electrification of transport or adoption of other energy sources than hydrocarbons. And this has been used as justification for a big push for deep sea mining. So a big question now is whether we really do need to mine or not, in terms of what technologies will come to the fore in future in terms of transport and other energies. But also, of course, if this activity does take place, how we're going to manage it in a way that is least damaging to the environment. I very much hesitate to use the term sustainable here because, in my view, ecosystems are pretty unlikely to recover, at least benthic ecosystems, from this type of activity. And as I mentioned with the UK UK accounting, marine accounting report, blue carbon is also really coming to the fore and no longer just being discussed in the context of coastal ecosystems. So we're all familiar with mangrove forests, seagrass beds, and salt marshes as blue carbon ecosystems, but now there's real attention on open ocean ecosystems as potentially blue carbon ecosystems as well. And in particular, a lot of interest in the role of the twilight or mesopelagic zone in terms of active transport of carbon into the ocean interior. So institutions such as Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution have recently adopted major new programs looking at the twilight zone in the context of blue carbon, but there is interest over a much broader spectrum of possible routes for carbon to be sequestered from the deep ocean. And indeed, also burgeoning interest on the carbon footprint of many of our maritime economic activities. And these are some figures recently pulled out from a paper from Henri Sala et al., which was published this year, where they estimated that trawling could actually be responsible for increased emissions of 1.47 petagrams of carbon per annum, particularly when it's been targeted at freshly, fresh grounds essentially, where trawling has not previously taken place. For those of you who are not sure what a petagram is, that's a billion tons of carbon. So really quite significant numbers here in terms of the effects of trawling on re-release of carbon into the system. Also, we're now seeing consideration of the deep ocean for other forms of carbon sequestration. This is not just CCS through things like CO2 injection into oil wells and so on. There are now projects being looked at, seriously looked at, by companies in terms of, for example, growing seaweed and disposing of that seaweed in huge quantities into the deep ocean. And of course, we have absolutely no idea of the potential impacts of very large-scale release of such organic material into the deep sea. So this may be another very active area of research in the near term in terms of thinking about trying to deal with the current carbon crisis. In terms of other deep sea industries, we have seen progress since the 2015 report. So, for example, we've seen further implementation in fishing of the FAO guidelines for sustainable management of deep sea fisheries in the high seas. And indeed, regional fisheries management organisations and states have implemented environmental impact assessments for deep sea fisheries, move-on rules for encounters with vulnerable marine ecosystems, and they've established areas to protect vulnerable seafloor ecosystems from bottom contact fishing. And indeed, we've seen limits to the depth at which fishing can take place, put in place in areas such as Europe. But it's not all good news. And indeed, I'll just illustrate some of the problems we still face with an issue I recently bumped into. This is the Syed Mala Bank in the Western Indian Ocean. It's a vast area of elevated topography in this region. It may host the largest seagrass bed in the world, or at least it did. It also has, in the shallow parts, zooxanthellate coral habitat, and many of the species described from this ridge, including deep water species, appear to be endemic to the bank or indeed the ridge. The ecology of this entire region is extremely poorly characterized. So we're still in a situation of knowledge deficit for large areas of the deep sea. It's a candidate World Heritage Site because of this fantastic seagrass bed and other ecosystems. And indeed, it's an ecologically and biologically significant area as classified under the CBD process. Now, there was Russian work in this area, which was summarized by Fortsett and Eva in 2008, who summarized the work on it and concluded that any trawling on this habitat may irreversibly destroy seagrass and coral biotopes. Now, the area is under joint jurisdiction by the Seychelles and Mauritius in the JMA, Joint Management Area. However, they only have jurisdiction over the seafloor. Fisheries management is actually undertaken by the Southern Indian Ocean Fisheries Agreement, or SIOFA, an RFMO for the Southwest Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, in 2015, a Thai trawling fleet turned up at the Sayadamala Bank and began to trawl it. And in the first year of fishing, they took over 22,000 tons of fish, taken by 56 trawlers. And of course, since that time, catches have plummeted, probably because of overexploitation of the fishery. And heaven knows what's happened to the benthic ecosystems actually on the bank. The RFMO has been informed of this, this activity and the potential damage it's doing, and so far there's been very little action to correct this activity. So, of course, this brings into mind, where we have to put in place protection for all of the ocean, including the deep sea. And again, referring back to this paper from Ulrich Sala and colleagues published this year, they actually looked at where you would protect the ocean if you were trying to protect biodiversity, but also protect productivity in terms of fisheries and that blue carbon function of the ocean as well. And indeed, their modelling work seems to indicate that there are places in the world where you can get kind of triple wins as a result of protecting the marine environment. And of course, this was all done in the context of the whole 30 by 30 policy push at the Convention for Biological Diversity. So are we actually really increasing fundamental knowledge in the deep sea? Well, I think actually the progress here has been really encouraging over the last 5 years since the report. And I've just really pulled out a small example from deep sea biology work here. So please forgive me, physical oceanographers and all the other disciplines involved in deep sea work. But I thought this was a very interesting example of where this intention to mine the deep ocean has really pushed scientists to go in and try and understand this region of the deep ocean, which is actually very remote and very deep, 4,000 to 5,000 meters or more, in the context of the environmental impacts of deep sea mining. So here you see the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone mining licensing area, and the work that was illustrated on this slide essentially used environmental DNA or DNA barcoding to actually characterize whether or not the fauna across this region was homogeneous or not. And what you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here is illustrated on the top set of graphs there, the species richness across different phyla in these different protection areas in the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone. And you'll see that the communities do differ quite markedly across this region, and in particular, they differ in different environments. So not just this study, but several others that have used similar approaches are particularly noting differences in the biota between seamount and more flat abyssal plain habitat. So these are studies being carried out using very new approaches, and where we're facing a really significant taxonomic impediment in terms of knowledge, actually giving us some understanding of the distribution of life in this part of the deep ocean. Barcoding is really changing the way we're starting to look at ecosystems and potentially changing our ability to monitor biodiversity in the ocean. Barcoding is the use of short DNA sequences to identify individual taxa. Metabarcoding is where environmental DNA is used to amplify and sequence the particular targeted barcoding molecule across an entire community. But this is set to actually advance further with the adoption of third-generation sequencing technologies, which really enable the sequencing of entire genomes from environmental samples drawn from places like the deep ocean. And then genomic skimming can be used to pull out key genes to identify taxa to a higher resolution than with a single barcoding molecule. But we do face some real challenges in the adoption of this new technology. Barcoding libraries at the moment have high levels of error in terms of the data already submitted to them, and in fact up to a third of the data in some cases may essentially be incorrect in some way. And of course, only a very small number of species are represented in these libraries. We don't really understand the limitations of these approaches, and methods really do need to be standardized so they're comparable across studies and across geographic regions. And of course, this still means that, you know, we still need to actually identify and describe species, without which it's very difficult to understand their biology and their influence on community ecology. And of course, we also have to link data across biodiversity databases, which contain both genetic and species information. So there's a big data fragmentation problem as well. Other branches of science have also, or other branches of marine science have also been looking at the deep sea mining problem. Here I've just pulled out an example which is more physical, where a combination of observations at sea, so experimental release of sediment into the water column, has been combined with modelling to really gain an improved understanding of the dispersal of sediment plumes released from surface barges involved in deep sea mining operations. And what this particular study seemed to demonstrate was that the sediment plume is likely to settle across really large distances as a result of multiple mining operations within an area like the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone. But as to the environmental impact of this settlement, that would very much depend on information coming from experimental studies on the tolerances to such contamination from deep sea biota. So this doesn't really tell us about what the actual impacts are likely to be on biology, but it tells us about the area across which that sediment is likely to settle and the depth of settlement that's likely to occur. Again, another study connected with deep sea mining using combination of modelling and observation, this time trying to look at the potential food web impacts of deep sea mining on communities. And here a combination of literature research and analysis of deep sea video was used to look at trophic and non-trophic interactions between organisms in the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone and Peru Basin. And what they've done is they've modeled the effects of nodule removal on these communities. And the results were an estimated loss of up to about a fifth in terms of taxa, and something like a fifth to a third in terms of the food web or interaction network links. And most important in terms of these interactions were essentially organisms which form biological structure on the seafloor in this region, and in particular stalk sponges. So we are making progress in terms of knowledge, even if it's slow. But another thing that really has leapt forward over the last 5 years has been the proliferation of autonomous platforms for marine research. This includes the platforms themselves, so everything from surface drones to gliders, AUVs, floating platforms carrying sensors, midwater floating, and then the sensors themselves for physical oceanography and biogeochemistry, but also an increasing number of sensors suitable for biological work as well. So DNA sensors, video and acoustic sensors employed from either ships or from autonomous platforms, moorings and so on. And of course, one of the big questions on Research Council minds at the moment is what is the future for oceanographic research fleets given these huge advances in autonomy. I'm currently involved in a project looking at this for the Natural Environment Research Council. And what's here is not conclusions from that study. This is very much a personal view from my reading of the current state of the situation. Essentially, deep sea science still is going to require ships, but probably in the future, we're going to be looking at these ships as kind of motherships for the deployment of a wide variety of other platforms and sensors, which will massively increase the bang per buck in terms of data collection from these vessels. We will need to look at alternative power sources for these ships. So whether that future is going to be in terms of hydrogen or ammonia or other forms of power. At the moment, ships are probably the single biggest contributor to the carbon footprint of certainly the UK research councils. So that certainly has to be looked at. But essentially, there is still going to be a need to interact with the deep ocean environment, particularly the seafloor, and particularly for biological sciences. We're also going to have to start to look at new technologies to increase our understanding of midwater and deep pelagic ecosystems, as they still remain a big hole in our understanding. Another part of the changes in how we're likely to operate these vessels is going to be a change in our ability to communicate in real time, ship to shore and back from shore to ship. This is going to allow things like virtual participation in cruises, adaptive management of seaborne operations, real-time data collection and delivery to users. And finally, it's likely that as well as kind of conventional ships, we are going to see the development of autonomous vessels, which will operate alongside the crewed fleet as well. In terms of funding, this was another of the key areas that the report addressed. We've certainly seen a surge in terms of philanthropic funding of ocean science. And indeed, it's been private money which is now put into the hands of scientists the first submersible which is capable of diving anywhere repeatedly in the ocean. And of course, you're all probably aware as well of operations like the Schmidt Ocean Institute, which is again a privately funded organisation operating a research ship for the use of scientists. We're going to see more of these coming along. REV Ocean is building a ship. We're also seeing operators such as Ocean X operating vessels out in the deep ocean. And certainly to my knowledge, there are several other vessels which will shortly also be added to this private philanthropic fleet operating for deep sea science. We're also seeing more public-private partnerships as a result of this, and more industry funding for deep sea science. And indeed, I've already shown some examples from deep sea mining where indeed industry has paid for the sea time which has been used by deep sea scientists to undertake some of these studies. Post-COVID, there are going to be many demands for government funding. But I think there is a recognition of the importance of science and technical advances in terms of driving a knowledge-based economy and knowledge-based industry, and in particular in the context of the blue economy. So hopefully the increasing prevalence of the blue economy for coastal states will mean a higher demand for ocean science. This does start to raise questions about, how we actually treat data at the moment as being free for use and essentially open for non-commercial use in the future. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. So having said the signs are encouraging for increased employment of deep ocean scientists, actually, if you look at the recent study carried out by the IOC, the figures from 2013 to 2017 actually show a very mixed picture in terms of funding for ocean science. So whilst we've seen an increase for countries like the Russian Federation and the UK, other countries such as the US, Italy and Japan have actually significantly decreased their funding for ocean science. And of course, the science budgets in developing countries are much lower than those in developed. If we look at human capacity for ocean science, and this is from the same report, again, a similar picture in terms of this gulf in equity between marine scientists present in developed versus developing countries is very, very noticeable. And here you can see the human capacity represented for various countries in terms of the size of these circles on this diagram. So one of the other major things that's happened since 2015 is the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. This was declared by the UN in 2017 and initiated last year. It's aimed to generate global ocean science to support the Sustainable Development Goals. And already we've seen 335 approved actions for this program for the next 10 years. Many of these are directly relevant to deep ocean science. And I've just pulled out one example here, Challenger 150, which is a project that aims to really make a transformative change to our understanding of the distribution of life through the deep sea, but also to increase capacity for ocean science in an equitable fashion across all countries. And of course, the governance arena hasn't sat still in the last 6 years as well. And probably the biggest thing happening in terms of the deep ocean are the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction treaty negotiations. These are looking at establishing a legal framework for protected areas, environmental impact assessments, the use of marine genetic resources, and capacity building and knowledge transfer for areas beyond national jurisdiction in the ocean. And the deep ocean has come up time and time again during these negotiations, and also during informal contact groups around the negotiations, which have helped to inform the negotiators as to the scientific issues around this very important treaty. Of course, there's also the climate negotiations going on with COP26, and that has seen an increasing role of the oceans in people's thinking around mitigating climate change, but also in context of marine ecosystems being damaged by climate change. And of course, next year, we'll also be looking at the Conference of Parties for the Convention for Biological Diversity, where the 30 by 30 policy will be discussed and hopefully adopted. So all of these things are directly relevant to the deep ocean, some more than others. But I know that many deep sea biologists have been involved in all of these discussions. Now, finally on to data. With all these new sensors out in the ocean, we're seeing a trend of vastly increasing data production. But it's certainly the situation that many databases, particularly in the biodiversity biology sphere, are still highly fragmented. So they're not interoperable, they're not suited to machine communication. And essentially, because of that, they're not going to meet FAIR principles. And this is really critical in terms of translation of data to actionable knowledge for decision makers. So I think what we're going to see in the next few years is the advent of essentially data platforms or digital twins of the ocean. And these are systems which essentially you plug databases into and which harmonize those data. They also securitize the data and make it traceable, and essentially provide plugins for people to develop applications to turn those data to useful knowledge, whether that be for ocean industry, marine spatial planning, policy, or law making, whatever it happens to be. To get there, we've got a big job to do, both technically and socially, because in order to defragment these databases, we need to look at technological fixes, but also fixes in terms of the way that we're actually doing things at the moment. So adopting similar practices, adopting the same languages or semantics for databases and so on to enable this harmonization of data. And my final area to touch upon is ocean literacy. We discussed the importance of this in the report in 2015. And I think the great news here is that we've seen a lot of traditional forms of outreach on the deep sea come out over the last few years. So quite a few books on the deep ocean, which have been quite popular with the public. Programs on TV, including to children, such as Octonauts, with good factual content on the deep ocean. And then, of course, Blue Planet 2, which had a really strong effect on public opinion around the ocean and its state. And of course, film and video production now generally comes with other forms of content in terms of social media and so on. But I would argue that actually we're not doing enough still in this area. Traditional forms of outreach often speak to the converted and not to the general mass of the public. And really now we're investigating technologies such as immersive experiences and things like citizen science technologies to get people more and more involved in the ocean. This is one example of a digital immersive experience in Japan, which has proved immensely popular there. You may have visited, if you're in the UK, the recent Van Gogh immersive experience in London. Well, these are now being developed for the ocean alongside significant social media activities as well. But the full range of the types of public engagement that other sectors are looking at really need to be looked at in the context of the deep ocean. So things like celebrity endorsement, crowdfunding, sponsorship, really to try and give the opportunity for people, the general public, to be engaged and involved with deep ocean science and deep ocean conservation. So to summarize that very quick tour de force, I would say that a lot has changed in the last 6 years in the deep sea and in deep ocean science. New scientific approaches and technology are providing new insights into deep sea ecosystems and the impacts on them. The development of the blue economy makes deep sea science more important than ever. And in particular, this translation of data to knowledge. Funding and capacity are at risk still, despite the importance of the ocean economically in terms of supporting life on Earth. We still face really significant equity issues in ocean science. And we are still not doing enough to engage the public and other stakeholders in the deep sea. So I will leave it there. I would just like to say thank you to Sheila and the European Marine Board for the invitation to speak, and also to all the people who were originally involved in EMB Report 22, and to all of you for listening.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was great. It was really nice to get a good overview of, I think, all the progress that's been made since that document came out, and also, unfortunately, all the things that haven't really advanced enough. So thank you, that was great. I haven't got any questions in the Q&A yet, but of course I have some, and I see that Paula has also sent me a question from the Secretariat point of view. So she says, very interesting to hear about some of the ways that we can reach out to the public about the deep sea in the future. So the immersive experiences, I think, will be a great way. So could these types of engagement also support science research and training? Do you think there's ways that we could use that, you know, with some social science, understanding how people perceive these things, for instance, and who might we need to work with to make this a reality?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing is that if you're engaging the public, and particularly engaging young people, then really you're, you know, sowing the seeds of your next crop of marine scientists. So I think in that context, this type of activity is really, really important. People have got to see marine science as a, you know, something that's really exciting, something they want to get involved with, but also something that will provide them with a career. So I'm actually working on one of these immersive experience projects at the moment, and that project will certainly have a very strong element of education involved with it. So certainly I would hope that it does that job of sowing those inspirational seeds, but also informing the public as to the importance of deep ocean science. And I mean, the technology, digital technology involved in these types of experiences now is advancing to such an extent that it could be used indeed in training. So, you know, you could literally put somebody digitally in a submersible at the bottom of the Marianas Trench looking at life or physics or whatever it happens to be at that depth. By the same token, I think we will see this technology to allow people to virtually participate in cruises, perhaps even with 3D digital holographic imaging to assist that whole process. So yes, I think there's a very interesting potential here in terms of training as well as public engagement.
Yeah, I was actually, that was going to be my question, the discussion or the point you raised about virtual, you know, being on a cruise virtually. For somebody who gets seasick, that seems like a great idea, although I suspect I'll still get seasick if I see the water doing that. But how would that actually work? You know, I was kind of wondering, you know, from my one experience, you have to be there to count the fish and do all of that. So somebody still has to do that. He still has to do the work. So how does this virtual thing work?
Yeah, I mean, I would see it as more widening participation in cruises rather than completely replacing.
Okay.
Certainly, if you're in my type of business where, as you say, you have to take the animals out of the sampling buckets, you have to measure them, photograph them, and everything else. Mm-hmm. You know, somebody has to be there to do that, at least at present. Mm-hmm. However, you could imagine a situation where you have a core team of 5 or 6 people on the ship, and then other experts coming in for, you know, say we've got experts on fish, octopuses and snails. Mm-hmm. On there, other experts beaming in who have expertise in crustacea and jellyfish. Mm-hmm. Really instructing those on board as to how to treat the samples and where to sample from and so on. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think this is something which is going to become a reality. And for sciences which can be more automated in terms of sampling, then, you know, there are real possibilities of undertaking remote cruises. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. There's also a question from Britt about how the deep sea can be included in the digital twin of the ocean when there's still so many unknowns, and that was also a question that was in my mind about the way you described the digital twin. To me, seemed more about the databases, whereas from what I know the digital twins to be, there's a lot of combination with, you know, scenario testing or simulators, models, and so forth. So how do you think, how can we really incorporate, how can we really have a digital twin of the deep sea if we have so little knowledge of what's down there?
Yeah, that's true, and lack of data is still a problem for the deep ocean, particularly mm-hmm. in terms of biodiversity, which of course is what I tend to deal with. When you get below 1,000 meters, then, you know, the amount of data really drops off significantly. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. We've got to go out and get more data, and I think some of these remote sampling technologies and autonomous platforms are going to help us do that. But for certain types of marine science, you know, basically we just need a bigger effort to get out there and get the data in. Mm-hmm. I think the similarity between data platforms and digital twins is this whole data harmonization aspect, mm-hmm. and also the aspect of, you know, really translating data to knowledge, understanding, as you say, scenario testing, to really give stakeholders, people like policymakers, a wider range of options to think about in terms of, you know, their decision making down the line. So yes, they're not the same thing, but they do have many similarities.
Yeah, I think that a digital twin without the data is just a fun computer game. You know, it's Avatar. But if you really wanted to make a digital twin useful and real in that sense, then you really need the data to underpin it. So I think, to me, those two things, that the one is you can do quite a lot with data just from a management perspective, that you can't really do if you just had an avatar or a virtual world with no data to substantiate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other area that I didn't elaborate on, and I did mean to when I was talking about data, is this whole question of data traceability and trustworthiness, but also ultimately who is going to pay for these systems. And that does raise some really serious questions about really continuing with policies where all data are essentially free. So I think there's going to have to be some very serious thinking over the next few years about, how to increase the confidence in data. So how to make it traceable from data producer all the way through to user. But also, if you can do that, if you can trace that data, then it means there's a pathway there back from user back to data producer, which raises a number of possibilities. One is that data producers are more able to get credit for the data that they produce. But also, should we be looking at models where there is some form of charge, particularly for some uses of data which accrues back to the data producer? And I think there's some really interesting discussions that are going to be had around that, particularly with the advent of facilities like the Ocean Data Platform, which are looking to develop a self-sustaining model in terms of funding.
And then just finally, I think we're nearly at the end of our hour, but there's a question also in the chat from Utaven asking, what advances and challenges do you see at the marine science policy interface beyond the technical advances that's needed, such as digital twins? So really the question is, what are the challenges between the marine science and the policy?
Yeah, the challenge, the first challenge is that really the scientists don't understand that well what the policymakers need, and vice versa, the policymakers do not really understand what limitations come with scientific data from the oceans, particularly from an environment like the deep sea, where those data might be pretty thin on the ground and can change with a single significant discovery paper. So there needs to be an exercise done. Let's say an exercise. There needs to be a much bigger effort to bring together people on that science policy interface, so that both sides of the coin have a much better understanding of what they're dealing with and what they need to provide.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly from the Marine Board perspective, that's what we always try to do, and that's why we publish these kind of documents, so that policymakers have a better understanding. So I don't think there's any other. Oh no, I lie. There's one question from Willem de Moor. Do you see a future in which we can have acceptable framework conditions to start deep sea mining activities? And if that's the case, what would that look like? A question for another hour discussion, Willem.
I could, yes. I think the big issue that we have with deep sea mining at the moment is we've got a big historical legacy in terms of these licensing areas around the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone, and unwinding that is a big problem. So what we've seen is the license areas be established, then scientists get together and say, well, we don't know anything about this area, so we'll put in these conservation blocks, but basically put them in areas which are not going to be very controversial for the miners. And then now the science is starting to catch up, in terms of getting a better understanding of what's actually living down there. So in my view, to get to a situation where that mining could take place without doing permanent and long-lasting damage to biodiversity, I think that whole licensing area would need to be redesigned in order to properly exploit a much smaller area of the seafloor, and to ensure that much larger representative areas of the seafloor were left untouched. I think the engineering around the mining itself needs to be scrutinised, particularly in terms of sediment plume generation and sediment release from the surface. So, you know, I'm not saying that the options are not there to undertake deep sea mining. That is a societal decision which needs to be made. But I think the current framework makes it very difficult to undertake in a way that is in any shape nor form sustainable or does least harm.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I will just add that I know that at SAMS, there was in fact some work that looked specifically at these plumes and how, you know, the smothering effect of them. So I know that they were doing some work in Borneo area, I think. So they, you know, I don't know if they got around to publishing that yet. So there's definitely some science for that stuff out there. But I think we have to end because we're over our allotted hour. So I want to thank you very much. And I just want to end by saying thank you again very much, Alex, for your talk, and to let people know that our next third Thursday Science webinar will take place on Thursday the 18th, again 1300 hours, so 1 o'clock, and it will be on our new document on underwater noise in Europe that just came out yesterday. So if anybody's interested on hearing what's in that document, then do join us next third Thursday on the 18th of November. So thank you everybody for being there, and looking forward to seeing you again in a month's time. And thank you again, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. Thanks. Everybody.
Bye.